Imagine you need to make a really big health decision, maybe for you, maybe for someone close to you.
Yeah,
You'd want the best information, right? Probably from medical research, clinical trials, maybe.
absolutely. You'd rely on that.
But how sure can you really be about th- the integrity of that research?
It's a question of trust. It's
Yeah.
completely fundamental, not just for patients, but for doctors, nurses, everyone relying on the evidence.
And it seems like confidence has taken a hit lately.
Yeah, there have been some pretty high-profile reports about, let's say, questionable practices, and that shakes things up for everyone.
Okay, so let's dive into this. Our deep dive today is focused right on research integrity, specifically within randomized clinical trials, RCTs.
Which are often seen as kind of the gold standard for medical evidence, right?
Exactly. So our mission really is to unpack what the research says about this. We're looking at an article that analyzes the literature on the challenges.
Right. We want to understand the problems from like simple mistakes all the way to more serious stuff, and importantly, what can actually be done about it.
We're using excerpts from this analytical article, and it makes a really strong point. Research integrity isn't just some nice-to-have academic thing.
No, it argues it's absolutely essential. It's foundational for good healthcare, for making sure decisions are based on solid evidence.
Okay, so first things first. What exactly is research integrity in this whole picture?
Well, the article stresses it's a pretty broad idea. It goes way beyond just, catching fraud after the fact.
So it's more proactive, about building trust.
Exactly. It's about how you conduct the research from the get-go, following ethical principles, professional standards, making sure the methods and the findings are genuinely trustworthy.
But it sounds like it's not always straightforward to achieve that, even with good intentions.
That's a key point. One factor the literature often brings up is training, or rather, the lack of it sometimes.
You mean training in how to actually run a clinical trial properly?
Yeah, specific training on design, on conduct. It's not always a standard part of medical or health education.
Huh. So researchers, even if they're brilliant scientists, might just not know some key procedures.
It's possible. Things like making sure you register the trial publicly before you start enrolling patients,
Okay.
or having a detailed, documented statistical plan beforehand, or knowing the best ways to share data responsibly. These are all integrity safeguards.
Right, and the article mentioned something about an academic culture of secrecy. How does that fit in?
Well, if researchers are maybe hesitant to share methods or early findings,
Mm.
perhaps afraid of being scooped,
Yeah, understandable.
it can unintentionally create an environment where, well, suspicion might arise. It's sort of chips away at that collective trust.
Okay, so that environment makes it easier for different kinds of problems to pop up. The sources sort of categorize these behaviors, right?
They do, which is helpful.
Yeah.
On one end, you've got the really serious stuff, often called major misconduct. Think FFP, fabrication, just making up data,
Hmm.
falsification, messing with the data or results you have, and plagiarism, using someone else's work without credit.
That sounds pretty clear cut, though the article mentions some nuance like self-plagiarism or replication.
Right. It's not always black and white. Reusing your own text needs thought, and replicating studies to confirm them is actually valuable, not misconduct. So yeah, nuance matters.
Okay, that's the major stuff. What about the other end?
That's where you find what the sources call minor misconduct, or maybe a better term, questionable research practices, QRPs.
QRPs, so less serious than FFP.
Generally, yes.
Hmm.
They might be things like bending the rules on methodology, maybe not following standards perfectly, but the key thing is they seem to be much more common.
More common, so their overall impact could actually be pretty big.
Potentially huge, yeah. Because if lots of studies have these smaller issues, it really muddies the waters for the entire field.
So FFP is the big, often deliberate wrongdoing. QRPs are more common, maybe less intentional sometimes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The article distinguishes that FFP is often intentional or knowing or reckless. But other issues, including some QRPs, can be just honest mistakes, unintentional errors, maybe from that lack of training we talked about.
Got it. And there was one specific QRP the research focused on a lot: spin.
Ah, yes, spin.
We hear that word a lot, usually not in a good way. What's it mean for research?
In this context, spin means reporting the findings in a way that doesn't quite accurately reflect what the study really found. It can distort how people interpret the results.
How does it distort them? Like making things look better than they are?
Often, yeah. highlighting positive bits, downplaying results that weren't significant or maybe weren't favorable, and it can be deliberate or sometimes just unconscious bias.
And the article said this spin can show up pretty much anywhere in a paper.
Everywhere. Title, abstract, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. It can creep in anywhere.
Can you give some examples? Like, what's linguistic spin?
That's using sort of hype words, calling findings excellent or groundbreaking or effective, when the actual data shows maybe a modest effect, or it wasn't even statistically significant.
Okay. And what about the title or abstract?
You might see a title claiming effectiveness, but then you dig into the paper and find the main outcome the study was designed to measure. Well, it wasn't significant.
Ah, so if you only read the abstract, you get the wrong idea.
Exactly. The abstract might paint a much rosier picture than the full results section does.
What about in the methods or the analysis section? That sounds sneakier.
It can be, like saying a trial was double-blind when, realistically, the treatment made it obvious who got what, so true blinding wasn't really possible.
Okay.
Or a big one is presenting subgroup analyses done after the fact, post hoc analyses, as if they were the main point of the study.
Like looking at the results and then finding one small group where something interesting happened and focusing on that.
Precisely. It wasn't planned, but it gets highlighted. It's like deciding the target after you shoot the arrow.
Gotcha. What about p-hacking? That sounds bad.
It's definitely a problem. P-hacking is essentially, well, imagine you have your data and you run lots and lots of different statistical tests or look at the data in different ways.
Okay.
Eventually, just by chance, you might find one comparison that looks statistically significant, maybe with a p-value less than 0.05.
Right.
P-hacking is when you report only that significant finding and you don't mention all the other tests you ran that showed nothing.
So it's like fishing, trawling the data until you catch something significant.
That's a good analogy. It makes a chance finding look like a real effect.
I see. So selective reporting is a big part of spin, choosing what data to show, or maybe even which previous studies to cite.
Yes, absolutely. Cherry-picking data points or only citing studies that support your view, especially easy with big data sets.
And then in the interpretation part.
You might see inappropriate interpretation. Like if a study finds no statistically significant difference between two treatments, researchers might claim they are equivalent, but not different isn't the same as proven equivalent statistically.
Right. That's a subtle but important distinction.
Or claiming the treatment definitely worked because some secondary outcome was significant, even though the primary outcome, the main thing they set out to measure, wasn't.
Wow. Okay. There are many ways spin can happen. So what's behind all this? These QRPs, the spin, even the FFP, is it always bad actors?
The sources suggest it's complex. Sometimes, yeah, it might be deliberate deception, but often it could be a lack of understanding, maybe just following established but poor practices in a particular field,
Yeah.
or unconscious bias.
And the culture, right. You mentioned pressure.
Huge factor. The publish or perish culture in academia is real if your career depends on getting published, and especially if journals seem to prefer splashy positive results.
There's a temptation to make your results look splashier.
Exactly. There's an incentive, unfortunately, to spin findings, especially if they're negative or inconclusive, to make them seem more publishable, more impactful. The article really highlights this pressure.
So it's not just individuals making bad choices, it's the system itself that might push them that way.
That's a big part of the argument, yes. Systemic issues are definitely at play.
And going back to what you said earlier, even simple unintentional errors matter if they undermine trust, right? If researchers aren't trained or if that culture of secrecy prevents openness.
Absolutely. It all feeds into the same problem, eroding confidence in the research findings.
Okay, so we've painted a picture of the problems: errors, spin, misconduct, systemic pressures. Let's shift gears. What does the research say about solutions? How do we fix this?
Right. The focus does shift towards solutions and positive changes. And the article really stresses that general be ethical advice isn't enough. We need specific recommendations, specific tools tailored for clinical trials.
Makes sense. So where do we start?
Well, a lot rests on institutions, universities, research centers. They need to actively integrate good scientific practice into training. Maybe mandatory courses, maybe dedicated integrity mentors or coaches.
So build it in from the start.
Exactly. Plus, clear institutional codes of ethics. Really robust rules about conflicts of interest and promoting transparency are key.
And what about that academic culture? Can that change?
It needs to. The article talks about moving away from relying so heavily on metrics like, journal impact factors or how many times someone cited the H index.
Because those reward getting published in fancy journals, not necessarily doing rigorous, useful research.
Pretty much. They can prioritize quantity or venue over actual quality and integrity. The good news is some institutions are starting to rethink how they evaluate researchers, looking at broader contributions.
That sounds positive, but it can't just be institutions, right?
No, it has to be systemic.
Yeah.
Funders, journals, scientific societies, everyone needs to be involved working together. Integrated initiatives across the board.
Okay, so system-wide changes. Are there specific tools or practices that researchers themselves can use?
Yes, definitely. We already touched on prospective registration.
Right, registering the trial protocol before starting.
Yes, in a public place, date stamped. That transparency is huge for preventing things like changing outcomes later or hiding negative results.
Because everyone can see what you plan to do from the start.
Exactly. It holds researchers accountable to their original plan. Another major tool is using reporting guidelines.
Like Consort. I've heard of that one for trials.
Yes, Consort is the big one for RCTs. There's also Prisma for systematic reviews, DREPEP for reporting patient and public involvement.
So what do these guidelines actually do?
They're essentially checklists. They tell researchers exactly what information needs to be included in their paper, about the methods, the results, everything to make the report complete and transparent.
Ah, so it helps the authors make sure they haven't missed anything.
Yes, and it helps editors, reviewers, and readers understand the study properly. They can see if key information is there, if the methods were sound. It standardizes things, makes it harder to obscure problems.
Standardization and transparency seem key. What about sharing the actual data from the trial?
Data sharing is a big topic. It's increasingly seen not just as good practice, but as an ethical obligation.
Why is it so important?
Well, think about it. It allows other researchers to check the original analyses, to verify the findings. That's crucial for trust. Plus, you can combine data from multiple studies or use it for new research questions. It optimizes resources.
Makes sense. But are there challenges? Privacy, maybe?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Handling sensitive patient data requires careful planning and safeguards, and there's ongoing discussion about exactly how much data should be shared and in what format. But the direction is clear.
Are there systems in place for this?
Yes. Things like clinicaltrials.gov have been around. There's the Open Science Forum. And newer platforms like vivly.org are emerging, specifically for clinical trial data.
So the infrastructure is growing.
It is. Requirements differ between countries, but there's a push towards harmonizing standards, making data fair findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable.
Okay, another thing the article mentioned was patient and public involvement, PPI. How does involving patients help integrity?
This is a really interesting and increasingly important area. PPI isn't just about having patients participate in a trial as subjects.
Right.
It's about actively involving patients, caregivers, members of the public as partners in the research process itself, working alongside the researchers.
Partners, how does that work?
They become part of the team, essentially. They bring their lived experience. Patients are the real experts on living with a condition,
So they can offer different perspectives.
a crucial one. They can help shape the research questions so they're actually relevant to patients. They can help decide which outcomes matter most. They can review patient information sheets and consent forms to make sure they're understandable.
Wow, okay. So it improves the research from the inside out.
Exactly. It enhances relevance, quality, ethics, transparency. It builds integrity right into the design and conduct. And the article notes that funding for PPI is growing, and reporting how you did PPI is becoming expected, using guidelines like GRIPP.
So embedding integrity right from the start with the people the research aims to help. That's powerful. Okay, one last area the article touched on. What happens after a study is published?
Right, because publication isn't the end. Sometimes issues are found later, leading to a correction, or in serious cases, a retraction of the paper.
And the article's take on that.
Is that when a retraction happens, especially for integrity reasons, it's not just a failure of the authors, it's a sign that the system failed earlier. It allowed flawed research to get through peer review and be published.
So it points back to needing stronger checks before publication.
Exactly. And retraction rates, the article mentions, have been increasing in some areas, like obstetrics and maternal fetal medicine, often due to misconduct.
Is that necessarily a bad sign? Maybe it means we're getting better at finding problems.
Could be a bit of both. Better detection, but also maybe more problems to detect. Either way, when corrections or retractions happen, they need to be clear and easy to understand. But ideally, we catch things earlier.
And looking even further ahead, the article mentioned AI.
Just briefly, yeah. The potential for using artificial intelligence tools to automatically screen papers for signs of data manipulation, statistical errors, or other anomalies. That could be a future tool in the integrity toolkit.
Interesting. Okay, let's try and sum this up. Research integrity in clinical trials is clearly vital. Without it, the evidence we rely on for healthcare decisions isn't trustworthy.
Absolutely, and we've seen it's challenged by a whole range of things. Genuine mistakes, questionable practices like spin that might blur the lines, right up to outright fraud.
And often, systemic issues are feeding into this lack of training, the pressures of academic culture, maybe not enough transparency historically.
But importantly, there's a lot happening to address it. Better training, institutions taking responsibility, efforts across the whole research system.
Plus, specific tools, prospective registration, reporting guidelines, and a big push for transparency through data sharing.
And crucially, bringing patients and the public into the process as active partners through PPI.
So, thinking about this from the perspective of you, the listener, why does all this matter?
Well, if you're someone who uses healthcare or reads about medical breakthroughs, understanding this complexity helps you appreciate what goes into producing reliable evidence.
It maybe makes you a more critical reader. You might ask, was this trial registered? Were patients involved in designing it?
Exactly. It gives you context. It helps you understand that research is a process, and ensuring its integrity is an ongoing effort.
And the sources left us with a powerful thought. When integrity fails after publication, it really points to a failure earlier in the system.
Right. Which leads to a final question maybe for all of us to think about. How can we, whether we're researchers, doctors, patients, policymakers, or just citizens trying to stay informed, how can we all contribute to building research integrity right into the fabric of the process from the very beginning?
Instead of just focusing on catching problems after they've already happened?
Yeah. How do we embed it proactively
Hmm.
at every single step?